you can't really separate emotion from money. Money's inherently emotional. It just has such a personal significance to all of us. And it's often tied with life events as well. So marriages, divorces, births, deaths, starting a business, selling a business. You can't separate emotion from money, in my experience.
You're listening to the B2B Revenue Executive Experience, a podcast dedicated to helping executives train their sales and marketing teams to optimize growth. Whether you're looking for techniques and strategies or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. Let's accelerate your growth in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the B2B Revenue Executive Experience. I'm your host, Cory, and today I have with me James Woodfall. He is a formal financial planner and now specializes in emotional intelligence and behavioral coaching within the financial services industry. He's the founder of Raise Your EI, a company focused on providing science-based training in emotional intelligence to help financial professionals and firms improve communication, client relationships, and performance. In addition to all of his training and consulting work, James is also an author. His book, co-authored with Cliff Lansley, The Heart of Finance, is a practical guide for finance professionals to develop emotional intelligence for building strong and lasting client relationships. James, welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for the intro. It's very comprehensive. I couldn't have said it better myself.
I try, especially, when everyone has such great achievements, I try to get them all in there. So appreciate it. Kind of before we dive into the deep end of sales psychology and emotional intelligence and IQ, can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to this in the first place?
Yeah. So my background, most of my career, I was a financial planner. And so I did that for about 15 years. So half of that, I had my own business, which I sold in 2022. And I think I was always interested in psychology, and client psychology, and self-development, so I think since I probably started my career, I'd always, every year done some sort of training or, a course, to just improve my skill set. So I'd done things, to become a better financial planner, alongside sort of the technical qualifications that you have to do. I invested in, things like an executive coaching diploma, to get better at having those sort of coaching discussions, which quite often I think people don't appreciate that that's sort of part of the nature of the role of, of a financial planner. It's not just a sort of technical, transactional aspects of, sitting down with someone and just going through the facts and figures. Quite often, people come to financial planners with, fears, worries, anxieties. They want to speak to a human and have someone, ask them great questions so they can think through, options they've got available to them, whether it be that around, I'm thinking about buying a house, I'm thinking about, saving for retirement, what do I do? So I thought, look, what about, doing a coaching qualification? That's got to be something useful. And it absolutely was. And after that, I came across a master's program in communication and behavior analysis, which really took that to a different level, which was learning how to read and understand emotions in people's, verbal and non-verbal behavior, which I found absolutely fascinating because you can't really separate emotion from money. Money's inherently emotional. It just has such a, personal significance to all of us that, and it's often tied with life events as well. So marriages, divorces, births, deaths, starting a business, selling a business, you can't, sort of separate emotion from money, in my experience. So actually being able to, get a read on people's emotional experience, and then start understanding how that changes how you interact with them and how you change how you communicate, to be an effective communicator, which is the end goal. It was a real fascinating, master's program to do. So that's what kind of got me into the sort of relationship between, emotional intelligence, and finance, because that was part of the, I suppose, research that I did for the sort of dissertation side of that study. So I did a project looking at the relationship between emotional intelligence and job performance, in financial planners. So it's quite interesting because I think people are kind of, if you're sort of generally aware of emotional intelligence, the sort of some of the headlines that people are aware of is like, look, it's good for, personal health. So people, if they score high on an EI assessment, they generally have sort of better subjective health, their subjective sort of well-being. But when it looks at things like performance at work, you have sort of better performance at work. Harvard Business Review have done a lot of these, done a lot of these sort of studies, and some people might be familiar with, that they're the sort of leaders with high EI, that tend to be more effective. But then it sort of trickles down into things like, staff retention. So I thought, well, look, there's a huge bunch of research out there generally about emotional intelligence and job performance. Why don't we sort of zone down and just see, whether it's relevant for the financial planner role. And so luckily I found it was relevant. So the research was actually actually went somewhere.
Nice. Well, no, I really imagine it would be, right. And I find it intriguing because I think it's one of those points that is perhaps counterintuitive at first. I think that at least in the business and sales world, sometimes people think of finance as that role that is maybe a little bit more detached from the human to human connection, right? They're the ones that are looking at the business performance, right? Sometimes making the hard calls, and sometimes that requires you to sort of take that emotion out of it, and say, well, I'm going to have to do X, Y, or Z, and that might affect people, but otherwise the business is going to go kind of downhill off this cliff. But then when you look at financial planning, I think you're absolutely right? People come, I think, inherently, like you said, with a lot of anxiety, right? With a lot of fears, hopes, dreams around, hey, like I'm hoping to buy a home, or I want to be able to retire, or I have these health concerns. Will I be able to do X, Y, or Z? So yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense that there would be a really potent intersection between the two in that field.
Yeah, I mean, financial planning effectively is pretty much sort of follows a sort of consultative selling framework. And that in the early stages of kind of a new advisor-client relationship, the bulk of the discussion is on both parties really kind of sort of fact finding and getting to know each other and building a relationship. And really from the kind of advisor side, they ask a huge amount of questions so that they can, understand what's important to the person from, what's their financial situation, but all of their sort of, goals, dreams, aspirations for the future. And a lot of that is kind of filtered down to the more information that you get, the more that you understand the person. And when you come to say, well, look, these are the types of products, financial products that you're going to need, to meet your objectives, you deliver that really at the end. It's very rare that someone comes in and just says, I want, just gives you reads off a menu, just says, right, I want a pension, I want one of these, I want one of these, I want one of these.
Right.
So because it's consultative, and it's very trust-based as well, as I said, because a lot of these decisions involve multiple choices, investment, carries risk. And a lot of people, the reason that they either go to, main reason they go to a financial planner is because they don't have the technical knowledge or expertise or confidence to do it themselves. But if they've never worked with a financial planner before, there's always that kind of question in the back of my mind of is this person going to do the right thing for me, or are they going to do the thing which earns them the most money?
Right.
So that's when you sort of start to sort of empathize with what's going through people's minds as they come in to sort of engage.
And so I think that the last point that you made, right, about is this person going to have my best interest at heart, or are they going to, particularly in the sales world, are they more concerned with hitting their quota, right? So how did you go from the studying emotional intelligence in financial planning to really making that jump wholesale into the selling world and more of the consulting and training right there?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think people wouldn't necessarily put emotional intelligence and sales together, but I think if you read into the literature on kind of job performance, there's a research which has been done on sort of emotional intelligence scores. So if you did a research design where you put, say, a bunch of salespeople through an emotional intelligence assessment, you could reliably correlate their emotional intelligence scores with their sales performance across a range of different job roles. And some of the reasons for that is that, especially within sales, a lot of selling, especially sort of consultative selling or financial planning, is very trust based. And one of the sort of components of emotional intelligence is really being an effective communicator. So being able to read emotional cues and cues of emotion in others, and respond in a way that is appropriate, which carries influence. But also, that's only one half of emotional intelligence. The other half is being able to recognize and regulate our own emotions. So that, really helps, for example, if people feel, that, they can't handle difficult conversations, they get uncomfortable, and they don't like conflict. So they don't, push, hard in handling objections or negotiating fees, for example. So if advisors don't have the ability to sort of regulate their own discomfort, that might show up as that actually they don't, that they don't get higher fees on the basis that they're just not comfortable asking for them, or they're just not comfortable, pushing back, when clients are making demands. But from, say, being an effective communicator, one of those things about reading emotional cues in others that I mentioned is being able to empathize. So if you can recognize from someone's behavior that, they're experiencing, one emotion particularly, and we've got a range of different emotions which would show up in our behavior, the sort of basic emotions, like fear, sadness, happiness, disgust, contempt, surprise, and then I can never remember all 7 in one go, so it'll come to me. But we can recognize these kind of basic emotions in people's behavior, and it tells us a little bit about how they're thinking, so we can change how we're communicating as a result of that. But empathizing is kind of it's a real key thing to do in sales in order to be successful. And there's 7 habits of highly successful people that Stephen Covey. One of those was seek first to understand before you are going to be understood, and that's quite a key component. Is that the more that you can put yourselves in the shoes of the person that you're I suppose selling to, you can understand their perspective. You're really engaging with them as a kind of a cooperative partner, to understand their needs and help them be fulfilled. Then you are being kind of an adversary and trying to sell them something which they're not interested in or don't want. So fundamentally, these skills correlate with high emotional intelligence.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And James, you mentioned those 7 emotions. What are the subtle signs if say I'm a salesperson, right, and I'm saying now to the client for the first time, I want to empathize, I want to build credibility and trust and a rapport with them. What signs should I be looking for cues into their emotional state?
So we've got a range of different channels that we communicate. Well, I'll call them channels, but there are a range of different communication channels that we use. So one is facial expressions. So we use the face to communicate all sorts of things. I appreciate I'm gonna have to describe what I'm doing because otherwise it won't work on audio. But we have effectively a set of configuration for muscle movements for each of the basic emotions. We also use our face for things like what we call emblems or gestures. So like if we were walking down the street and we kind of knew each other, or you'd raise your eyebrows and you kind of go, and so that kind of raise your eyebrows and raise the eyelids kind of sort of means it's like a little bit of an acknowledgement, hello, isn't it? So in the UK, we've got, it usually comes with you all right, which is like abbreviated. And you all right can mean lots and lots of different things.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard it's actually quite an odd thing for people to come to the UK to be constantly asked, are you all right? It's very, I think, probably a bit culturally specific, but we can use our face to gesture. So, it can, and that's one of the things I think that trips people up is, we use, different gestures to sort of communicate things which aren't necessarily emotion. But when we do use the face to communicate emotion, it's hardwired and it happens before we're consciously aware of it. So it'd be like, if you imagine that you're in a room and all of a sudden like a loud fire alarm goes off, you'd probably see, a reaction on people's faces where their kind of mouth drops and, the eyes go wide and they do this. And that's surprise, and that's something sudden and unexpected. It might be startle, but startle's different because people sort of screw their face up and sort of go into a ball. When you're startled, you sort of protect yourself. So car backfires in the street or something. But basic emotions show on the face, before we're consciously aware and we can control them. And even with like an hour's training in just understanding which sort of muscle configurations link with each emotions, an hour's training has kind of shown in research that people can actually get pretty good at it, pretty good at spotting these. And then you have something called micro expressions where it just happens in less than half a second. So they're really quick movements across someone's face. It's quite good in sales conversations because we have this sort of movement around the lip corner. And it only happens on one side, and it's over the lip corner being pulled back, and then a sort of this dimple appearing. It happens on one side like this. And it's related with the emotion of contempt, which basically means like someone's taking a moral stand, taking the moral high ground. So for salespeople, that's a really interesting one to look for, because if you see contempt, like in a fee negotiation, it's not going well. There's a kind of contempt is one of the sort of they're called the four horsemen, but it's just by a guy called Gottman who said, look, and this is mainly research looking at what causes relationships to break down. But he said, look, there's four things. One's stonewalling, which is kind of and this was in couples therapy really. But stonewalling, was one where one person just sort of shuts down and stops talking. Defensiveness, was another one. So sort of in arguments, people getting defensive. Contempt, and then actually related to contempt was another sort of facial movement, which was eye rolling. So people are sort of rolling their eyes. That's sort of quite a dismissive, thing to do. The four horsemen, if you see those in relationships within couples therapy, a guy that did this, Gottman, he effectively said that, majority of the time within a year, those people would be divorced.
Wow.
If one or more of them, was present. So within sales interactions, if you've got, if you're being defensive, when someone's, raising, objections and concerns or complaints with you, that's generally not a good, good way of interacting. If you see sort of contempt or eye rolling in your client, really you've got to think, what's gone wrong in this relationship? How do I get it back on track?
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I think that's a really specific and actionable one, the micro expressions to try to pick up on. Is there, where that leads my mind is, how do you distinguish between the emotional state that the client is bringing into the conversation, which may not be related to you at all, right? And the actual reactions in the moment?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think one of the things that gets confused is emotions and moods, and feelings. So emotions are different from moods. Emotions are usually sort of they're brief. They can be sort of seconds to minutes at most. If you're angry, you're not really angry all day. You're sort of intensely angry for like a few seconds, or maybe it's drawn out and it's sort of minutes. But emotions usually have an onset, a peak, and an offset. If you think about that, like you remember like the last time you were, like really sad or you were close to crying, for example, you probably weren't crying all day. It's probably there was one event that triggered it. You felt yourself become overwhelmed. You maybe you got this sort of tightness around your voice. Sort of as the muscles tense up around the vocal cords. But then it peaks, and then you gain control and you regulate, and it sort of offsets. But you can be in a bad mood, all day. You could be in a bad mood for a couple of days. You could be in a good mood. And we don't really know what sort of triggers moods or why we sort of slip in and out of them. But that it's, if someone, comes to say an appointment or, or meeting, one of the things that you do at the beginning of kind of every session is kind of calibrate, kind of what's the person's baseline behavior. And you try and do that within that sort of rapport building phase, sort of first few minutes of the interaction, where you get a feel for like, what's this person's tone of voice, what sort of, language are they using, how do they, if they smile, what does the sort of genuine smile look on their face? And you kind of calibrate, how are they sort of sitting, what's their posture, how are they talking with their hands, and, how are they gesturing? So you get a kind of feel for how they're interacting. And you do that every time that you sit down with someone, because I think, as you quite rightly said, you might meet someone who's in a bad mood. It might be nothing to do with you. It might be something that happened early in the day. But calibrating, just getting a feel for someone's baseline allows you then to spot deviations from baseline as you kind of go through your interaction. And what I mean by deviations in baseline is you might see, kind of a change of posture. So someone might tense up, at a particular point. And that could be tension around, someone starts, literally gripping, like, the arms of the chair, or, locking their feet around, sort of legs of chairs, or sort of, leaning forward, leaning back, change of sort of, where their head is. So these different things which we can pay attention to, but we only tend to notice them once we've got a feel for what someone's sort of baseline behaviors are. Now, it could be emotion, it could be discomfort, the behaviors don't tell us anything. And I think that's one of the difficulties of reading and understanding behavior, is there's no X means Y. There's no like, if you fold your arms, it means you're a bit defensive. It could just be that it's comfortable.
Right.
So you got to be a bit careful with, sort of drawing conclusions too quickly, but it's worth being aware to changes and then thinking, well, what was going on in the conversation at that point? So it's like if you put the price or the fee for your product, on the table and someone sits back and fold their arms, that kind of clues you into what was going on in the, at that point in the discussion, that actually that behavior, whilst it might not be defensive, combined with sitting back and withdrawing, increasing the distance, that might mean that actually there's something you want to dig into in terms of what they're thinking about, about the offer that's on the table.
Yeah, I really love that point of establishing a baseline every time, because I think a lot of people in sales tend to do that with small talk, but I don't think that there is much perhaps purpose behind it, right? It's almost like hey, let's just kind of get warmed up. How are you? Maybe you get like a general vibe check from the room, but do you have specific advice on how to structure those rapport building conversations to really get to know someone's, help read them, help to get to know their natural states over the, say, a few months when you have a sales cycle or something like that?
Rapport's really key. And I think the kind of the best way to, there are, sort of little sort of like acronyms that you can use if you're not naturally very good at it. But I think most people kind of overcomplicate rapport building. Rapport building is quite simply just be relaxed. And, the best advice is just to be curious and be interested in finding out, as much as you can about the person that you're talking to. Really, it's just a nice, conversation with open questions. And it's like, well, what did you do at the weekend? Actually I was out with the family. Oh, who's the family? And it's that type of conversation where you're being curious, you're being genuinely interested in the person. But one of the key things that I advise is that part of what you do in rapport building is mutual sharing and disclosure. Because I think if you want to do rapport building effectively, what's quite powerful from a kind of an influence perspective is finding common ground early. So, if you talking to someone and say, oh yeah, we went out with family at the weekend, who's the family? It's like, oh, we've got, dog, a couple of kids, and we went to this nice restaurant in so-and-so. If you've been there, you'd be like, oh, I went last month. What did you think? It's like, it's, connection. You've got a shared experience. You've both been to the same restaurant. You don't have to spend too long asking people questions before you find something in common. Most people that you meet, you've got far more in common with them than you realize. And it's incredibly powerful when you find common ground with people. And the way that I explain this to people is like, if you've ever been on holiday where you just meet someone who's, from the same town as you, or, from the same country, and, and you get talking to them and you just find that you've got all these common interests, yet you're in a foreign country. All of a sudden you're best friends.
Right.
And you just feel really, really comfortable talking to them. So rapport building is probably it's the first thing that you do to build trust and build influence, across the sales cycle. And you have to do it every interaction. So it's not a case of you kind of spend 15 to 20 minutes doing it, the first time that you talk, you sort of, meet a new client, and then you just straight to business every other time. You have to re-establish rapport, even if your sales cycle is like, say, 6 or 7 meetings before you get to, someone signing up. The other thing as well is it's culturally specific as well. So this was interesting. So if you go to let's say, for example, the Middle East, if you've got an hour's meeting booked in the diary, you'll probably spend 55 minutes on rapport and 5 minutes on business. If you go to Sweden or some of the Nordic countries, all the way around, don't like small talk, find it very uncomfortable. So you have to be, a little bit aware of kind of cultural nuances, with communication.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I love the point of, going back to basics, right? Open-ended questions, being curious. And I really loved in your example that you didn't maybe because I'm not a dog owner and I'm surrounded by hundreds of thousands of dog owners in Denver, but you didn't go for the low hanging fruit. You didn't go, oh, I have a dog too. Me too. I got a dog. It was, oh, I've been to that restaurant. What do you think? So I don't know, that felt really instructive to me, where it's maybe you choose the moment, right? You don't have to latch onto the first one. Maybe it's the third one. You will eventually find that common ground. And to your point, it'll come quicker than you think. I think that's excellent advice.
To share one of the studies which really kind of solidified my thinking on this, there was quite a landmark study done in the field of psychology, by, I think it was Tajfel and Turner. They did this experiment about, understanding in-group versus out-group, preferences. And so there's, it's quite a famous study. They took a bunch of Boy Scouts, down to a camp and they split them into like arbitrary groups, for no particular reason. It's like, well, look, you're the blue team and you're the red team. And just separating them into two different groups meant that they behaved adversarially to each other after a period of time. And they basically determined through the research that they could be totally arbitrary about what the differences were between the groups. But the minute you split people into groups, they tend to have a very, very strong preference towards their group. And it's like the others are the enemy. And it's a fascinating experiment. But what it basically tells us is that finding common ground early signals to someone, I'm not a threat, I'm part of your tribe. And if you're working in kind of a sales environment where, it's high trust and actually you need to, communicate, that you're cooperative, there's lots of sort of, trust in the, the sales process, signaling to someone that actually, and this happens, probably pre-consciously, I'm part of your tribe, we've got these common interests. It really makes it easy, for people to trust following that.
Completely agree. And so now that we've been talking a little bit more about emotional intelligence, I know that you have a concept of framing around logical and emotional frames. And I'm interested to hear more about this because when I thought framing, something pinged in the back of my head. And I thought of, it's got to be more than 10 years old at this point, but do you remember Pitch Anything, that book?
Pitch Anything? No, I've not read that.
So the concept of framing was essentially that I think it was Warren Clough, he put forward as like you had a power frame, you had a time frame, and you had an analyst frame. And, it sounds more aggressive than it was, but the idea was that you have to break those frames in a way as almost like a pattern interrupt, right? To get someone to really pay attention to you, because if you're going up against a power frame, they're already made their decision or they have all the power in the room. It's kind of a why should I listen to you thing. So I'd love to start off at kind of like a high level, what concept of framing are you seeing between the logical and emotional frames? Because I think that you're talking about something that's very different and I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah. I mean, to use an example from financial planning, it would be a logical frame would be, okay, you need to save for retirement, to avoid running out of money. In order to do that, you need to put, say, $2,000 a month into a pension. Let's assume that grows at 6 or 7% a year. That's going to compound and double your money every 10 years, which is going to mean that by the time you get to retirement, you're going to have enough money in that pot that if you draw down 4% a year, it's going to last you the rest of your retirement. Now, of course, we don't know how long you can live, but that's we're going to take a medium risk investment strategy. It's low cost. These are all the fees. These are all the reasons why you should do it because it's tax efficient. That's perfectly logical.
Right. But then I go by the dealership and I see a new car and I'm thinking, hey, I want that now. I might even die before I get to retire. I know the retirement is smart, but my emotions are pulling me in another direction. I assume you have a way to get me back on track at that point. So,
and this is part of individual differences, which I'll cover in a second. But an emotional frame would be someone says, well, actually, it all makes sense, but I just feel a bit uncomfortable with, whatever it is, parting with that amount of money, I'm going to live. And that would be when, you refer back to some of the, some of the things that the client told you in those early meetings. It's like, well, do you remember when we sat down and asked you, why is it that you're sat down with me? And you said your concern was that you're worried about whether you're saving enough for retirement. So you frame it, the emotional frame is just to say, this plan we've put together removes the worry around what you're saving for retirement. So forget the logical argument. You're speaking directly to the, the pain point or the problem that someone's trying to solve. And humans are interesting creatures, to say the least. And we quite often make decisions with emotions and then justify with logic. Emotion comes first. So if you can do your best to understand, what are someone's pain points? What's the emotion behind the sort of decision they're trying to make? And if you can tailor your, whatever it is that you're trying to sell to speak to that as a solution that solves that, that kind of need, or a want, actually, it's usually more a want, then sometimes you're going to have far more success than if you just focused on logical arguments. Saying that, as I mentioned, individual differences, people vary in their communication styles. Some people are far more tilted towards emotional framing than logical. Some are totally the other way around. As in, they really I need to see charts, I need to see graphs, I need to see 30-page reports. I need to read it before I make a decision. Other people will just be like, I don't care about the detail, just, how's this going to make me feel?
Yep. No, definitely. I think we've all seen a wide variance in that. And, it makes me curious because it's something that we talk about a lot. We talk about the concept of personal value in B2B sales. And it really is the same thing by a different name, right? Connecting back to that emotional frame. You put all the ROI projections in front of them, you build the value case with them, but it's, at the end of the day, if you're selling to someone where it's not their business, sure, they want to do their best at work. Sure, they have their career on the line. And at the same time, you really want to have those conversations where you can dig into like, hey, remember you said to me that, yes, you want to go public at the end of the year. So that means hitting $1 billion in revenue or whatever. But at the same time, you also said that, maybe your son has a little league game and you want to leave the office at 4:30 and not 6:30. Going back to something like that, right? So like, that's really what's in it for them at the end of the day. So I love that point. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, it could be like you said about, the careers online. It's just basic communicating. Look, we're, if you go with us, we're a safe pair of hands.
Yeah.
It's, we're not going to let you down. And that's part of empathizing is actually reflecting, some of those things back is, before they mention it. It's just to say, look, I know this is high stakes for you. And, it falls on you if this doesn't go well. We totally appreciate that. Here, let me explain, why we're going to make this, go as well as it can for you. Again, that empathizing as well is really powerful for influence and labeling some of those, some of those concerns that people have. It's really just to demonstrate that you understand and people will trust when they feel understood.
Yeah.
Common ground, is great. But actually, speaking to, I suppose, the kind of, person's pain points from an emotional perspective, and then labeling them and kind of playing them back to the person to demonstrate that you're really listening and you're really making an effort to understand. When you're on the receiving end of this, sales experiences are absolutely brilliant. If you've ever had a sales experience where someone has just, listened, not assumed, understood what you want, played back, so that they demonstrate they understand and then delivered the thing that you want, it's easy to buy. And we all actually enjoy buying stuff when we have that experience.
Yeah, no, I think we do. I completely agree. And there is still, I think, a divide, right? And like you said, it is such a pleasant experience. It is such a gratifying experience when someone takes the time to understand what's important to you, understand what's important to your business, and move forward with that curiosity and consideration. I want to zoom out a little bit, James, and kind of go back to the beginning of the conversation when we were both kind of talking about, maybe the perceived disconnect between the financial, logical mind, right, and the more emotional, empathetic, really connecting mind. So I'm thinking that if I go to some CROs and I say, hey, you know what I want to do today? I want to do emotional intelligence training. Some of them are going to roll their eyes at me, right? So how do you combat that? Or maybe combat that is too strong of a word, but how do you show them, the tangible real world examples and impact that are going to follow from training like this and by a focus on emotional intelligence?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll tell you a story for a second, because when I was looking at launching the business for AZEI, I spoke to my wife's aunt, who used to work for local government. She's retired now, but she worked for local government in the 90s. when Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence came out, I can't remember when that was, like 94, 95. And emotional intelligence kind of really boomed at that point. And actually, her local government, they were looking at emotional intelligence training, and, it was coming in, and she said it was a total waste of time. It was just like this big buzzword, and, didn't go anywhere and didn't do anything. It was interesting because she still had that mindset, now. But actually, I think the term emotional intelligence was only, it was only put together in the late 80s. When the first model of emotional intelligence and the first emotional intelligence assessment was created. So it was really in its infancy. It came out of, people looking at IQ and thinking, well, actually that's quite fixed. And actually, are there other intelligences that people might have? So if you're not if you don't have, say, a high IQ, are there other things that you can do? So are you, is there sort of musical ability? Is there relational ability? And actually, emotional intelligence kind of came out of this theory of multiple intelligences, of could you, and can you measure people's ability to effectively recognize and manage their own emotions, and then recognize and influence emotions in others. But we're near 40 years into that journey now. So whereas, in the 90s when, emotional intelligence was interesting, but I think what the sort of state of things is that people didn't really have a kind of an idea at that stage into how to turn that training into performance. Whereas we have a really good idea of that now. And actually the measurement instruments around emotional intelligence have got better. But actually we understand about what needs to go in a training program. So you can train people in, like I was mentioning about, how to recognize emotions in others and yourself. So you give people the knowledge and understanding of emotions. You teach them things like, I mentioned about, how to read, micro expressions. That was just one of those. So I just realized I didn't explain what the other channels of communication were. But emotions, show up in our voice. So our pitch, voice pitch and tone and volume. They change the language that we use. So we can read emotion cues in language. We can read how someone's interacting with us. So what we call the kind of interactional style. We can also get a read on what we call psychophysiology. So some emotions change how the nervous system. So it's like, probably heard of the fight flight response. So that's one branch of the nervous system taking over, that deals with, fight flight. Another one, we've got rest and digest, when we're relaxed. And we switch between the two all the time, but some emotions change, and activate the fight flight response. And we can actually pick up on some of those cues. So things like, sort of, you get a sort of dry mouth because the sort of digestion system shuts down. So you can pick up on people, licking their lips more often or taking drinks more often. As you can say, but actually, why is this person anxious at that moment? Psychophysiology is another one of those channels. So you teach people all those, these different ways in which people communicate information verbally and non-verbally. And you teach people kind of the theories of emotions, what triggers them, how they change thinking patterns. But then it has to be applied. And it's not just a case of you can give someone a bunch of theory in a couple of training sessions and say, well, that's going to mean that you're going to go and change your behavior at work and and increase your performance. It's just not true. So I think the latest research that we've got says that the average length of a effective emotional intelligence training program is about 6 months. So that means that you've got to combine knowledge with, kind of coaching exercises, reflective practice, and then you've got to, see people applying skills out in an environment, and trying out new things, which is going to lead to behavior change. So there's going to have to be part of that sort of feedback loop of, look, I'm out my comfort zone, I'm doing something different, I'm succeeding, I'm failing, but then I'm reflecting on what's gone well and what's not, so I can, increase my skill set, form new habits, and over time that leads to behavior change. Now, I think that, kind of research is quite, it's quite well established now that you can reliably train people and increase their emotional intelligence scores, which isn't the same as IQ. So with IQ, your IQ is fixed and it starts declining from about 25, quite sadly, which is why it's always age adjusted when you do these tests. But all those things like brain training apps, if you remember those that came out that said, if you do all these brain training apps, you can increase your IQ. It's total nonsense, because all that really happens is you just get good at these apps. It doesn't transfer into, solving complex problems at speed in the real world. So it's like, if you do Sudoku, you just get good at that. It doesn't mean that, you can apply it at work, for example, when you're smarter. But with emotional intelligence, you can take people, you can, assess them, you can train them, you can reassess them after a period of time. If they're showing a measurable increase in EI, then you can prove the training's effective. And then really you kind of look at the research as to what higher EI, has in terms of an impact on organizational performance. So in some of the research I did around financial planners, it's linked with increased turnover, so more sales. And at this point of the conversation, it should be pretty logical, to kind of understand why. You're better at rapport building. You're better at finding common ground. You're better at reading emotion cues and responding appropriately. So it means that you carry more influence. You're able to self-regulate, when appropriate. So these make you a more effective communicator, which make you a more effective salesperson. So increased turnover is one. In research, I found it leads to increased client retention. So if you have, clients that stay for kind of either long term and they pay you a recurring fee, or they come back and do multiple transactions, emotional intelligence is going to be key for maintaining and retaining relationships. And also, if you're getting all of these things right, you're really understanding people's needs and delivering on them, you're probably very referable. If you're in a sector, which means that you rely on, word of mouth referrals for a good portion of your new clients, you're going to get more of those, if you're delivering an emotionally intelligent, experience. And then just from an organizational perspective, we know that, the difference between working under an emotionally intelligent leader, versus someone who isn't, is markedly different for staff. And, research shows actually that, leaders, and the higher they go up the kind of the management ladder, the more, EI they need, the higher the EI score needs to be. Because if you've had the experience of working under someone who's, dismissive of your emotions, it's a horrible experience. So you see higher staff turnover, which of course is a cost to a business. It's a cost to the bottom line if you've got to, recruit and train people because, they're going out the door all the time. So from a leadership perspective, high EI in organizations, leads to, better teams, better collaboration, better communication between team members, lower, and which, shows up in terms of KPIs or things you can measure as like lower staff turnover, probably less hours lost, in terms of, miscommunications, things not being done properly because they weren't, delegated properly, or someone was assuming that the other person understood, what they were being asked to do. So you have sort of some of those trickle down effects. But really, if I were going to say convince an organization, as that chief revenue officer saying that we're going to do this, I probably wouldn't call it emotional intelligence training. I'd probably call it, something like communication or communication skills or sales skills training, just to pigeonhole it and put it in a box that everyone's going to understand. But then I'd just deliver emotional intelligence, because that's what's going to provide the ROI.
It makes perfect sense to me. I could keep talking about this, but unfortunately, that's not the way this podcast works. I got to keep it short. So as we move toward the end of the podcast, James, there are two questions that we ask every guest. And the first is, we're recording this in August 2025, looking out to August of 2030, 5 years in the future. What is one shift coming for the B2B sales world that not enough people are talking about right now?
It's kind of, I think the obvious one's AI. So based on the last 12 months, we've got no idea what the next 5 years is going to look like. No, I couldn't even guess. I can make a prediction, but I'd probably be, totally wrong, because the pace of change is just too quick. But I'm doing some consultancy at the moment with an AI, that's kind of helping financial planners become more effective. That's looking at training the AI to do some of the heavy lifting around, reading meeting transcripts and looking for cues of emotion, to give the salesperson prompts around, actually, this person's, feeling a little bit frustrated about this, or, they pause or pull back, when you mention this, maybe that's, is that, something that they're uncomfortable with. And so AI can potentially do some of the heavy lifting and take away sort of technical aspects. But if you can integrate it at the moment into, you give it access to language, so meeting transcripts, it can do pretty good things like, understand people's communication styles, even their personality. It can pick up, cues of emotion. and it could make, make suggestions about how people communicate more effectively with that individual. So we can do that now. So there's other tools and technology out there which look at, facial recognition. So there are companies out there that, if you give them video, they'll just analyze the face and look for those muscular configurations. I mentioned that you can teach humans to spot. They can do voice analysis. So they can pick up, if you just give someone a transcript, unless it's transcribed with all their ahs, pauses, stutters, repetitions, that's a whole sort of seam of data which you can analyze. So I wrote an article actually about, earlier this year, I think about, will AI ever be able to empathize? And the answer was no. But I think what it will be able to do probably within the next 5 years is have a very, very good read on analyzing human communication and looking at multiple channels of behavior. It'll probably be very, very good at that. The reason it can't empathize is because part of empathy, there's different levels of empathy. One is cognitive empathy, which means that, I understand sadness from a textbook, perspective. I understand what the definition of it is. And I understand, and you can understand in context why someone might be experiencing that emotion, but I don't share that. I don't feel it myself. Whereas actual human empathy, requires being embodied. And it's like, if you've got a really strong connection with someone, you see that they're upset, sometimes you start to feel the emotion, and it's called emotion contagion. And we do that again pre-consciously. So we do that without being aware of it. But for most of us, we can sort of recognize the sort of physical signs of that emotion and know it's in a reaction to an experience that someone else is having. So I think until AI is embodied, as in it has a body, and and it can have that sort of internal sort of sense, that comes in the emotion experience, it's not going to be able to empathize in the same way that human to human can. And I think we're probably far more than 5 years off of that happening. But who knows?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
I'm not making any predictions, but I would hope so. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's going to be a very strange place in 5 years' time.
Okay, and now final question. So looking back on your own journey, if you could go back 5, 10, maybe even 15 years, what's one piece of advice that you would give your younger self and why?
Yeah, if I go quite a way back, I think this isn't uncommon, for people sort of starting out in their careers, but I probably placed far too much pressure on myself to perform, so setting, massive goals and, putting a lot of pressure on myself, which at times showed up in stress. And I think I probably spent a lot of time not being confident in my own abilities for no reason whatsoever. And I think that's probably quite a common thing when you're younger, is lacking confidence. So what I would kind of say to myself is, look, things happen at the pace they happen. There's no point, kind of risking burnout just to push something through. But, obviously having goals is good because it motivates you and sets the direction. But you can overdo it and you can do too much. But also believe in your own abilities. Don't doubt yourself and don't try and second guess, what other people think of you. Because most of the time, most people you're dealing with have got their own anxieties about their own, about how they come across to others. So I think, once you understand that, you realize, we're all in the same boat here. So just relax a bit.
I think it's excellent advice and important advice. Sometimes bears repeating. You're worried about something else. The person across the table is probably worried about something they're doing. So
yeah, look, the phrase I use for this is, you're always at least 20th on someone else's list.
Yep.
We're just not as important as we think we are.
Yep. It's excellent advice to remember. All right, James. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, I've loved it. Yeah, it's great.
If people want to learn more about you and about your book, where would they go?
So books on Amazon. It's probably the easiest place to pick it up. So it's Kindle, a hard copy. It's on Audible as well. The Audible version came out last month. The website razorei.co.uk. People can go there. Most of the content on there is sort of geared towards finance professionals. But I do sort of one-to-one coaching work and consultancy across a range of different fields. So I think although it's sort of niche, I do effectively consult and do training on everything that we talked about, today. So people could always reach out, and say hi and have a chat, via the website. On LinkedIn is probably the place I'm most active. There's not many James Woodfalls on LinkedIn, so it'll be easy to find me.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.
No, thanks. I've enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the B2B Revenue Executive Experience. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.